So good morning, everybody. It has been an interesting journey. We are to the last session, session number 10. And when I had designed the program, I wasn't sure that I'm not teaching this session, but as all good things happen, they happen at their own time and at their own pace. Through the course of teaching this session, there were certain points when I needed certain clarifications, certain translations that I felt were not translated in the way they should have been in the references that I found. And that's when I used to go to Dr. Srinidhi, whom I met through a common IIM Bangalore group where we discuss religion and philosophy and science. So the group is called IMB Religion, Philosophy, Science. This is by far the most active group on my phone. In a typical day, you get about 1,000, 1,100 messages, could even be more. So that's where I met Dr. Srinidhi, and then during the course of discussion on that group, I figured out that he's quite a learned man. So anytime I had some issues with shlokas or something I was not 100% sure about, I used to always consult him. So today's session largely will be done by Dr. Srinidhi. But before that, let me just recap what we have done so far. So far we have had 9 sessions. And what have we covered? So in the first session, we talked about the introduction to Gita, where I mentioned that it's 700 shlokas spoken by Krishna to Arjuna. And we said it comes in Mahabharata in the Bhishma Parva, chapter 25 to 42. We discussed about the 3 pramans, the Pratyaksh Praman, the Anuman Praman, and the Shabd Praman. So that was session 1. Session 2, we did the difference between animal and man, and then we said that both animal and man are doing seed, which is sleeping, eating, entertaining, and defending. Now, so what's the difference between man and animal? And then we came to the conclusion that human beings can think. And then we said that if the only purpose of thinking is to do these activities called seed better than animals, then we are no better than animals. So in that context, I said that actual purpose of human being thinking is not so that we can sleep better, eat better, entertain better, or we can defend ourselves better, but because we have a higher purpose. The higher purpose is to explore who am I and why am I here, and what is my purpose. So that is actually the purpose of humans having a higher intelligence. It's not about eating more or sleeping more or defending more or entertaining better. So none of that is the purpose. Then in session 3, we discussed what is the goal of life. And because this class was highly enlightened, almost everybody came to the conclusion that the goal of life is happiness. The goal of life is to be happy. That's what everybody's seeking. And then from there, we moved on into Bhagavad Gita proper, and we started discussing the concepts that are there in Gita. And as far as I'm concerned, I like to divide Gita into 5 segments or into 5 key concepts. So I always say this, right? That Bhagavad Gita is nothing but telling you how a jiva or soul interacts with Prakriti or material nature in Kala, that is time, governed by the laws of karma, which are designed by the Ishvara or Supreme Controller. So that's what I always say. And with that, we started discussing the first concept, the soul or jiva. And through various ways, we tried to establish that, yeah, there is, most likely there is a soul. And the properties of that soul is Satchit Anand. That means it's eternal, it's super conscious, and it's always in bliss or in happiness. And then we moved on to the concept of Kala, and then I had shown you with the detailed calculation how the universe, the lifespan of universe itself is 301 trillion years. And this in turn is just 1 nimisha, and nimisha is smaller than a second, 1 nimisha of Vishnu. At least as per the scriptures, that's how they tell us about Kala. And then we moved on to the interesting topic of karma, which we discussed over 2 sessions. So we discussed the difference between karma and kriya, karma and duty. So all that we discussed. And then I also explained to you that the goal of life is not actually to do good karma, but to do akarma. And that for some of you came as a shock, but for some of you that was a revelation. So then from there we moved on to the concept of God, and we discussed that there is actually, when we use these words Bhagwan or Brahman or Paramatma or Ishvara, we tend to use them interchangeably, which is not wrong. But then at the same time, we should be aware of the precise definition of these terms. They have a precise meaning. So when you say Brahman, that is having one particular definition, and that is different from, let's say, Ishvara. But having said that, all of these are same ways of defining God, right? I mean, some way or form you're trying to define God, and we have various definitions by which we define. And in that context, I talked about these four concepts: Bhagwan, Paramatma, Brahman, and Ishvara. And then the previous session, we talked about gunas, and we talked about sattva, rajas, and tamas. And I told you how everything in life will start making more sense. You will start to be able to deal with them better if you just understand rajas, sattva, and tamas. And I said that in that context, I said that read Bhagavad Gita chapter 14 and 17 if you have nothing, even if you can't read anything else, because from a practical point of view, from an everyday point of view, these chapters probably are most relevant. Of course, the entire Gita is relevant, but if you do not have time, and if you're a very practical and pragmatic person, at least try to read chapter 14 and 17. So that's what I said. And then we said that we also discussed about yoga, because we are discussing, so now that we have covered all this, what is the purpose of doing all this? And I said that yoga means connection, and connecting to whom and what. So connecting to this concept of Brahman, Paramatma, Ishvara, or Bhagwan, whatever form you believe in, that is the purpose of yoga. And we said that there are four ways of achieving that, either through Gyan or Dhyan or Karma or through Bhakti. So that is by and large what I covered so far. And today's session is going to be taken by Dr. Srinidhi. So before he speaks, let me do an introduction. I'd send this on WhatsApp as well, but I'll just read out. So Dr. Srinidhi is a medical doctor. Now, most of us would struggle to get one doctorate. Now, Dr. Srinidhi happens to have 3 doctorates, or rather, he happens to have 2 doctorates. So he has a PhD, and he's also a medical doctor. And on top of that, he's pursuing his 3rd doctorate, which is a PhD in Sanskrit. So I don't know how he finds time and time to pack so many degrees at such a young age. When he comes on screen, you will see he's really young. He holds a PhD from IIM Bangalore in public policy. He's currently an assistant professor at the Public Health Foundation of India. He has been a serious student of Sanskrit and Vedanta for the last 20 years. And Vedanta, I told you, is the end portion of Vedas, which is basically what we also call Upanishads. So Vedas have 4 parts. Vedanta is the last part, which deals with the philosophy of life. He took a break of 3 years after his MBBS to explore unpublished Sanskrit Vedanta manuscripts in Oriental libraries across India. While pursuing PhD at IIM, he has edited and published he has edited and published a few previously unpublished manuscripts, and these include commentary on Bhagavad Gita by Banamali Mishra, commentary on Brahma Sutra Bhashya, and I think Dr. Srinidhi will explain what is the difference between Bhashya, Sutra, Tika, Tippani, and all that. So he did publish a commentary on Brahma Sutra Bhashya by Narayana, commentary on Brahma Sutra as per Ramanuja tradition, commentary on Bhagavata in Madhava tradition. And these are just few of his works. He has done much more than this. His edition of the 17th century Sanskrit commentary on Bhagavad Gita written by Banamali Mishra was awarded the best edited Sanskrit work by Karnataka Sanskrit University. He has been engaged both personally and institutionally in learning, teaching, translating, archiving Sanskrit texts, mostly those in the Dvait Vedanta school. Now, again, that's quite a loaded word, Dvait Vedanta school. So I'm guessing that Dr. Srinidhi will touch upon some of these concepts of what is Dvait, what is Vedanta. So he's besides this, he has also co-founded a schooling system of integrating Indian traditional knowledge into the mainstream learning. So that's an experimental school that he has set up, I think, somewhere in Bangalore. So maybe if he has time, he will tell you more about what that experiment is. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Srinidhi. Maybe Dr. Srinidhi, you can try and share your screen. I hope technology supports us here.
Thank you very much, Rahul. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, Dr. Srinidhi, the screen is visible.
Okay, great. Fine. So apologies. I mean, there may be a few disturbances with the network. I mean, I'm in a place which is completely closed because of. I mean, there is a construction work going on. So I'm trying to be at a place where it's most non-disturbing, but that also means that the network may be a little unstable. So let me know if there is any difficulty in hearing me at any point in time. So thanks, Rahul. I haven't actually done an online session, so I'm experimenting this. So we need to see how engaging or communicating this can be, because I'm trying to make it as I'm coming at the end of the series of lectures on Bhagavad Gita. So I thought it may not be that useful to get into specific shlokas or the chapter by chapter discussion on the Gita, but use this as an opportunity to explain some of the ideas that are embedded in the traditional knowledge systems in general, and use Bhagavad Gita as an example to apply some of the philosophical concepts that we see in largely in the darshanas. I'll talk about that a little later, but also in the larger corpus of Vedic knowledge system. So the plan is to situate these ideas that are explored in the Gita in the larger canvas of philosophical texts and thinking. So I'll use that to introduce a few frameworks like the tools of interpretation. And I'll use that a little more in detail, but I'll also explain a couple of other frameworks that are described in these texts. So that can help us in understanding the discourse like that of Bhagavad Gita. One clarification, I guess the title of the course has been Gita and Management. So I will probably be not touching on the second part of that. It's largely going to be a traditional view of the Gita. So mostly coming from what the anthropologists call an emic approach, wherein you be part of a tradition, understand its methods, its principles, its evidence base, and try to use that to get a better meaning from within the system, rather than an ethic approach, which is generally how, let's say, an archaeology kind of a discipline may work, where you're trying to work from an outsider's perspective and trying to look at this system without necessarily evaluating the internal ideas and methods. So I'm not debating which of these is better. I mean, they have their roles. In the current focus of this lecture, I'll be trying to look at it mostly from an emic approach. So trying to understand the Gita as the tradition, or the commentators, the translators within the tradition have tried to look at Gita. And given my exposure to Dvaita Vedanta, to a significantly larger part of my studies, so I'll probably using that lens. So just a couple of sentences on this before we can move further. So Vedanta is one kind of darshana. So we have the larger Vedic corpus. We'll talk about that a little later. Then we have the darshanas. That's mostly kind of theories. So who tried philosophical theories founded by different individuals at different points in time. Not that they weren't existing prior to them, but they tried to mainstream that idea. So we have Sankhya, we have yoga of Patanjali, Sankhya of Kapila. So there are six those darshanas: Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Purvamimamsa, Uttamimamsa. Those are the six darshanas, and each darshana has a sutra. That's the primary text or the fundamental ideas as composed by the original thinker. And then you have a tradition that tries to explain those ideas and tries to fit that in the larger corpus. So you have the Vedas, you have the Puranas, the Itihasa, the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and many such texts. And these theoreticians are trying to bring in a worldview and trying to fit what we call some kind of a best fit with minimal assumptions and and parsimonious worldview, and trying to explain if these texts can be consistently explained from these theories. And some of them come up with ideas like, no, I don't probably find a specific text more meaningful because of some reason, so I'll take that out of my evidence base and therefore focus only on the Vedas. And some would say, no, the Itihasa and Puranas have a larger role to play, so I'll include that also. Some may even take an additional step and say, I'll focus more on the Itihasa and Puranas and therefore derive another theory. So those are different possibilities of trying to develop those darshanas. And one such darshana is the Uttara Mimamsa darshana. I mean, we have the Purva Mimamsa darshana and then the Uttara Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa is the Jaimini tradition. The Uttara Mimamsa is the Vedavyasa tradition. Some call it Badarayana tradition. The larger consensus is it's the same individual, both Badarayana and Vedavyasa. So the Uttara Mimamsa darshana is largely in the canvas of the what's called the Brahma Sutras or the Brahma Mimamsa text. So the primary sutras for that darshana are the Brahma Sutras, and then you have multiple streams. So all these are called Vedantas. So more or less synonym to Uttara Mimamsa darshana is the Vedanta darshana. And the reason for that synonym is Vedanta is interpreted in two ways. One is that it is at the end of the Vedas. That's what Rahul talked about at the beginning. Another interpretation has been that Anta means something that decides. So a theory that decides the Vedas as to what is the primary purport of these Vedas, and that's called the Vedanta. So the Brahma Sutras in that sense are trying to actually interpret and provide a meaning to the Vedas in a way that we can understand the Brahman in a consistent way across the Vedas. So therefore it's the Brahma Sutras considered the Vedanta, and all those traditions that are coming under the Brahma Sutra tradition are called the Vedanta traditions. Within that, you have multiple traditions again. Dvaita, Advaita, Vishishtadvaita are mostly the three popular traditions within the Vedanta schools. And we also have Shuddhadvaita, Dvaitadvaita, and a few more. So Advaita is the teachings of Shankaracharya, Dvaita, the teachings of Madhvacharya, and Vishishtadvaita, the teachings of Ramanujacharya. And all three of them primarily base their arguments or the theories on three canonical texts. So the one is the Brahma Sutras, the second is the Bhagavad Gita, and the third largely the 10 principal Upanishads, the Ishavasya, Kena, Katha. I mean, there are 10 popular principal Upanishads. So these Vedanta schools are deriving their theories from these three set of texts. So of these, I mean, not that there is a significant inconsistency in the way the Gita is understood or the Brahma Sutras are understood, but the fundamental notion of these theories as to what's the relationship between the soul and the Brahman, or how exactly did this world come into existence, and what's the limit of illusion and reality. In those very fine, subtle discussions, you may find a few variations, but otherwise, the Bhagavad Gita as a canonical text, as a central text to these schools, is largely a common theme. So I'm putting this as a clarification just to be sure that we are not, I mean, there are multiple ways of looking at it, and I may be, engaging in the discussion of a specific kind of thought on the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, so sure. So I thought we could probably discuss 4 narratives. This I'm trying to put together from different textual sources on how we can understand Bhagavad Gita. One is to locate it within the larger textual corpus. And the second is the one that I just discussed, and I'll not be discussing that in detail. This is actually a central text of the Vedanta Darshanas, and thus derives its centrality or legitimacy in the larger canvas. And the third is the nature of conversation, the kind of questions that Arjuna asks, and what are the assumptions under which those questions become interesting. Because you see a specific kind of questions, and you also see conspicuous absence of another kind of questions. So I'll talk about that as a third narrative. And the fourth, I won't discuss much, and that has probably been the focus. I did see a couple of lectures that Rahul gave, and that's largely been the focus of this 9 session course on, that's the content of this conversation. So, and these 4 narratives give us 4 different approaches and 4 different methodologies, 4 different starting assumptions, 4 different implications to look at Bhagavad Gita. So let me start with the first one. So the texts are, I mean, the larger canvas of the Vedic texts. This is a shloka that is repeated in multiple Puranas and Smritis. It is talking about 14 14 sets of texts. Vidya Hyetas Chaturdasha. That's how it ends. There are 14 Vidya Sthanas. That's the different disciplines of knowledge streams in the Indian knowledge systems in general. And that's the Angani Vedaha. That's the first bit. So they're talking about the 6 Vedangas. And then you have Chatvaraha. Angani is the 6 Vedangas. Then you have Vedaha Chatvaraha. So 4 Vedas. So that makes it 10. And then you have Mimamsa, Nyaya Vistara, Purana, and Dharma Shastra. So these are the 4 added to the primary 10. And those 4, I'll talk about the Mimamsa a little bit, but largely one is a methodological approach. So the Mimamsa is also known as the Vakya Shastra, which is how do you interpret a sentence, or how do you understand the context. So there may be a set of sentences, or there may be a set of conversations, and it may be possible for different theoreticians to derive different meanings out of it. But can there be a set of rules that can govern how to understand a context, how to understand a sentence? And this is in fact, I think it's Justice Rama Joyce who has actually written an interesting book on how you can apply the principles of Mimamsa to understand Indian constitution and some of the laws. Because I mean, this is basically talking about when there are contradictions, how do you resolve? So can you have some consistent rules to define this interpretation? So that's the Mimamsa. And by Mimamsa, as I said, you have Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. Independent of the final theories that you derive from these Mimamsas, the set of rules that these Mimamsas talk about, and I'll talk about one such rule in a couple of slides later, and that's the methodological tool. That's the 11th. And then you have the 12th, that's the Nyaya. And the Nyaya Shastra largely refers to the one that is the Gautama and the Kanada system. It's basically talking about what is knowledge, what is evidence, how is knowledge generated, what do we do when there is a contradiction between 2 kinds of evidence, how do we evaluate whether the inference that we are trying to bring in is accurate, what are the fallacies of logic, those kinds of, it's largely the Indian logical thinking system. That's the Nyaya system. And so these 2, the Mimamsa and the Nyaya, are in some sense trying to make sense of the ontology provided by the Vedas through a methodology and an epistemology. Please don't take these as good translations, but I'm just trying to make a mapping with some of our modern terms. Methodology as a science is very well established in the Mimamsa Shastra compared to what we have currently. Whereas epistemology can be debated, and there is a good mapping between the Indian ancient logic and the current logical thinking and the Western philosophy, and where are the differences in the way epistemology has been taught. So Nyaya is the epistemic thinking, Mimamsa is the methodological thinking, and then we have two more, that's the Puranas and the Dharma Shastra. Purana here, I'm trying to interpret that in a little broader sense, not limiting to the 18 well-known Puranas, but also including the Itihasa. And there is a reason why we are trying to do that. And that's what we're trying to explain with the second quote. That's the quote from the Chandogya Upanishad, which is trying to say that Itihasa and Purana, Itihasa Puranaha, Panchamo Vedanam Vedaha. These are the four Vedas, and there is the fifth Veda, and the fifth Veda is Itihasa and Purana. And this is a claim within the Vedic corpus. And this comes quite often in multiple texts. So the Panchama Veda concept of trying to bucket the both Itihasas and the Puranas as the fifth Veda is well known. So therefore, the Purana in the first verse of the Vishnu Purana that I'm quoting should possibly be interpreted in a little broader sense of including both the Itihasas and the Puranas. So Itihasa is largely the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, whereas the Puranas are the 18 well-known Puranas, and there are also Upa-Puranas and another subset. But the interesting part here is how do they relate to the Vedas? And that is what I have highlighted in the line at the bottom here, that these are the set of stories with illustrations and explanations. So in some sense, you can probably get the essence of the Vedas through these Puranas and the Itihasas without necessarily going into a literal understanding of the Vedas. The Vedas are a little more convoluted in their messaging. They are, the language is not that easy, and the messaging is a little abstract, whereas the Itihasa and the Puranas try to bring those theories into, or those ideas into specific illustrative stories, and try to show how do you make sense of some of the fundamental theories that the Vedas may be trying to communicate. So in fact, Puranas and the Itihasas try to derive their own legitimacy by saying that, you should not study the Vedas without reading us. That's the Itihasas and the Puranas. And that's how there are multiple statements within the Itihasas and Puranas because of these, complexity of trying to understand Vedas independently without using the frames or the illustrations and examples given in Itihasa and Puranas. So, and therefore, for the rest of our slides, we will be, putting the Itihasa and Puranas in a little higher pedestal because of this additional benefit that they bring in. That in addition to the ideas, they talk about those with examples and illustrations. And then we have the Dharma Shastras, and I won't be touching much on that. In fact, most of the contentious issues that we discussed today about religion and Hinduism is actually related to a tiny part of the Dharma Shastras. And Dharma Shastras are talking about ethical values, human relations, and also talking about social systems, political rules. So it is in this area that you may find, changing societal norms requiring some changes in the fundamental way these were constructed in the Dharma Shastras, or trying to understand them in a specific historical context, or locating them in a philosophical school. So there is a lot of contention that's going on that you see in the political religious debates about Hinduism, but unfortunately that's less than 1% of the actual corpus, and we seem to believe that that's the actual teaching, and even that, when you ignore the 99%, then that 1% is easily misunderstood, and when you try to socially construct that, it becomes much more messy. So except that, I'll not be talking anything more on Dharma Shastras. So these are the 14 Chaturdasha Vidyasthanas. And the Itihasa Purana take an interesting and probably the most important role in that text. So starting from the whole corpus, we have now come to the Itihasa and Puranas. So then we move on to understanding what I meant by the Mimamsa. So I'll just give you an illustrative example, and then we will move to linking the Itihasa Purana to Bhagavad Gita. So why do we need these Mimamsa tools? So this is one such example where you have tools described in the Mimamsa literature. So these are 7 tools. This is one such framework, and there are many such frameworks in the Mimamsa tool. So the idea there is you have a sutra, you have a storyline, you have an idea described, but those are typically in the form of a sutra. And the sutra is very crisp, very short, and sometimes it's actually wanting more words and sentences to even make a complete meaningful sentence. So then you're forced to actually add a couple of words or add a couple of sentences and try to bring in your own ideas from other texts to make meaning here. So there it becomes necessary to have a set of rules. But the additional beneficial part of this trying to be crisp and amenable to multiple meanings is the fact that you try to engage much more rigorously. I mean, this is my own personal experience. I mean, these texts, 700 verses in the Bhagavad Gita, a rigorous study in any of these traditional schools takes a minimum of about an hour of learning for about 3 years to actually make a very rigorous analysis of the 700 verses. But if you compare that with a 700 verse or a 700 sentence well-written a newspaper article op-ed, so you can probably read that in a couple of hours max, or even if it's a research article, probably a half a day, even if you're analyzing the methodology, etc. But so, and how does that compare with this kind of a rigor and the deliberate, crisp and layered nature? So in my own understanding, it's because of that you go back to each verse every time when there is a contradiction. You go back to understand multiple interpretations and try to analyze, okay, which of these makes more sense? And therefore, when you're trying to make a very powerful point and you're making it in a very crisp way, the time that you are engaging with, the time that you are investing in understanding that verse becomes significantly more, and therefore your comprehension, your retention of that idea increases so many fold. And so the reason why I'm able to talk about Gita with very little preparation today is because of that 3-year study on the Gita that is necessitated because of the crispness of the Gita. So this pedagogical method is largely constant in most of the darshanas and the Vedic texts. So they're very crisp. Therefore, you need to engage for a much larger time period, and you get the message. When you get it, it probably stays with you for a much longer time. And that's the idea of trying to make things a little more complex, though it may be a little demotivating for the beginner. In fact, that's what I have seen with a lot of my friends and a few students, that well, the learning curve is too steep. But once you are there, then you see that the amount of time spent has a benefit in terms of the retention and the quality of comprehension that you have. So because of that nature, it necessitates these tools. So this is one such tool. And this tool is a content analysis tool. So you have a sentence, you have a context, how do you analyze? And so they're saying, okay, look at these 7 aspects in that group. So what's the upakrama? What is at the beginning? What is at the end? What is an idea that is repeated? Is there a novelty? I mean, so is there a novel idea that is presented in this context? And is there a specific idea that is presented with a benefit attached to it? For example, in the Gita, I'll apply this to Gita at a later slide. In the Gita, you see that Krishna says, surrender to me and you will be liberated. to understand my supremacy, and that will resolve most of your problems. So this mapping to a specific benefit is considered as a tool to know what's the message that the text is trying to provide. So if there is a specific message that is mapped with the benefit, then that message carries more weight. So when you look at these, and then you have some illustrations. So when you look at any text, try to map a specific message at the beginning. What is the message at the beginning? What's the message at the end? What is a specific idea that is repeated multiple times? Is there a new idea that is novel in the sense not easily seen in any other text? So then those messages should be considered as the message of that text. And that's how you interpret the real message or the real meaning of a text. So this is one such framework that the Mimamsa provides. Okay, so now coming back to the corpus and the Mahabharata and the Gita. What would be your usual approach, Rahul? I mean, I'm okay to take questions in the middle if there is some really pressing clarificatory things that make it difficult to comprehend any future discussion, or maybe at the end.
I think whatever you're comfortable with, so far whatever you have presented, I think is okay.
Okay,
but I personally always encourage people to stop at any point that they think that a clarification is warranted. So
okay.
It's totally up to the audience. If they feel that they need to interject, they can do so.
Sure. I mean, if there is really a pressing clarificatory question, I'm okay to take it at any point. If there are explanatory questions, let's take it at the end. But I think I may have to be looking at the chat for this, right? So, okay. So on the Mahabharata, so now we came to the first round of conclusion that
Dr. Srinidhi, you want to go full screen?
Yes. Sure. So then within the corpus of the Puranas and the Mahabharata, the Itihasas, the Mahabharata has a much higher and an interesting role, because when you look at this, a couple of references that I'm giving here. One is from the Matsya Purana and the other is within the Mahabharata. That Mahabharata is actually an amalgamation of not just the Vedic thoughts, but also all the 18 Puranas and the Ramayana story. You do see the Ramayana story in a very summarized way in a few chapters in the Vanaparva in Mahabharata. And this Matsya Purana claims that Ashtadasha Puranani Smritva Satyavati Sutaha, the son of Satyavati Vedavyasa, remembering all the 18 Puranas, then Bharatakyanam Akhilam Chakre Tadupabrumbhitam. He composed the text called Bharata, Mahabharata, which had all these primary meanings and the messages and important stories of the Puranas embedded in it. So therefore, Mahabharata is at a very higher pedestal compared to all other texts, because it has the Ramayana story within it. It also has the aspects of Puranas within it. And it also claims to have Lakshena Ekena Yat Proktam Vedartha Paribrumhitam. It also has the meanings of the Vedas. So therefore, Mahabharata, in fact, there are some metaphorical descriptions that say that, in a balance, the weight of these texts were actually measured, and the weight of Mahabharata exceeded the weight of all other texts. And that's one of the meanings given to the word Mahabharata. It is Mahan, it is literally huge, and it is Bhara. It's very heavy in its volume as a content, and it is heavy in its essence. So essence, because it has the Puranas, it has the Ramayana, it has the Vedas embedded, and is literally heavy. I mean, it's a 1 lakh verse huge text. And therefore, Mahabharata comes as one text that probably is is a summary and an illustration of the Vedic corpus. So now, starting from the whole corpus, we have now come to the Mahabharata. And now is an interesting mapping with the Gita. And this is, I would say, a very a clever interpretation that I have seen. In the very first chapter of the Mahabharata, there is this verse. It says, Manvadi kechit bruvate. Some consider Mahabharata as Manvadi, and some consider it as Astikadi, and some consider it as Uparicharadi. These are the three ways in which Mahabharata is understood. Vividham Samhita Jnanam. The knowledge of Mahabharata is, it has multiple layers, and that's how the learned look at it. And this is a statement in Mahabharata. Most people thought that this is actually talking about, okay, Manvadi means the story starts with Manu. Astikadi means the story starts with Astika. Adi means beginning. So Manu Adi is the story is starting from Manu. The second way to look at it is story starting from Astika. And the third way is to look at it as the story starting from Uparichara. Madhvacharya, the founder of the Dvaita school, I referred to at the beginning, says that, well, that's a very apparent interpretation, and it doesn't really fit to the overall narrative in that chapter. So because it is saying that this is how people understand Gita, Mahabharata. And so if you say that it is starting from A, starting from B, and starting from C, that's not really an understanding. It is just that the interpolations or some actual beginning is considered differently. But other than that, there is no fundamental insight into the way of understanding. And he says, Astikadi, Manvadi, and Uparicharadi actually do not refer to any of these individuals, but it is actually talking of something completely different. And he says, Adi as a term refers to origin. So you shouldn't think of it as an origin of this. Mahabharata is originating from this story, and that's not the idea. The idea is that Mahabharata has an origin in this idea. That is, it has an origin in Manu, it has an origin in Astika, it has an origin in Uparichara. And origin refers to the central idea. So it originated from this idea. And what's that idea? He says these are the three ideas that Mahabharata is talking about. One is the story of Pandavas, because Astika is a common term used for believers. And you know that the story of Pandavas has, there's no question that they were believing in the rituals, they were believing in the Brahman, they were believing in the Vedic corpus. So the whole narrative of Bhagavad Gita is embedded in the system of believers there. So the Pandavas were an example of those believers. So this story of Pandavas is actually the Astika level interpretation. And then there is a Manvadi level interpretation, and that is Manu refers to Manas. So the whole story of Mahabharata can be understood from a layer of a psychological interpretation. So the conversation between two characters is actually a metaphorical representation of the conversations or the conflicts that we may have within our minds. And that's what I meant by illustrative stories at the beginning. So the Vedas are not really talking about the stories, but there are ideas. But Mahabharata is talking about a story, but is actually illustrating an idea. So that's the second level interpretation. And the reason I have highlighted that is, this is how you derive the centrality of the Gita. Because the Gita is actually talking about these mental conflicts, the psychological disturbances that Arjuna is going through. So the overall essence of this level of interpretation is actually captured in the Gita. So in some sense, Gita is a summary of the second layer interpretation of the Mahabharata. And then there's a third layer, and that is Uparichara. Upari is above, and Chara is walking or at a more fundamental level, doing anything. So the real doer is the Supreme Being. So the whole the story of Mahabharata is talking about that Lord, So that's the third level. And this actually maps with an interesting traditional account, which says that there are two texts that need to be considered fundamentally central to Mahabharata, and those are the Bhagavad Gita and the Vishnu Sahasranam. And it's interesting that the second and the third layers that I'm talking about are actually the essence of that idea, because one is talking about the mental domain, and that is what we see in the Bhagavad Gita, and the third is talking about the names of the Lord. So therefore everything is actually being finally summarized with understanding the Lord. So that's the Vishnu Sahasranam. So therefore you have these three layers of the meaning of Mahabharata, and that's how you derive the centrality of Gita. So to illustrate, I mean, this is, we can't go into the details of this, but just an illustration that this is not a figment of imagination, but in Madhvacharya's work, he actually provides a list. I mean, it's actually a huge list, but I've given just an example of how do you need to interpret the story to get that second layer meaning that I talked about. That is, so if there is a conversation through the character of Yudhishthira, that's the Dharmaraj, then you need to interpret that as what may be the position taken by Dharma. If the conversation is by Nakula, for example, then that's the position taken by Sheela. Sheela refers to personal character. So, and then if there is a conversation by Sahadeva or some behavior that Sahadeva is exhibiting, then that is the behavior of a person who is personifying the aspect of Vinaya. Vinaya is obedience. So then Bhima he has a huge canvas, Bhakti, Jnana, Vairagya. So he because he is the incarnation of Vayu, and Vayu has a much higher role in the Upanishadic thought, and therefore he refers to 10 qualities of Vayu. So any conversation that Bhima engages in should be interpreted as a conversation that is personified, or a person representing Bhakti, Jnana, Vairagya is actually talking. So these conversation and battles and contradictions in the story can be seen completely from these mental faculties, from the lens of these. And most importantly for our discussion, the Arjuna's character is also mapped with Shravana, Manana, and Dhyana. So basically listening, then thinking about it, and then contemplating towards or meditating. And that's what Arjuna, his character, his kind of questions in the Bhagavad Gita represent. So if we move from the actual story to this frame, then we are in the domain of the Bhagavad Gita. So that's the linkage between the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. So it's actually the complete interpretation of the Mahabharata in the second layer, and as summarized in the Gita is actually the summary of the Mahabharata in that second layer. So therefore, we started with the Vedas, we came to Mahabharata, and the summary of that Mahabharata is the Gita. And that's the beauty of why Gita enjoys that centrality. And that's my first narrative. And this is a huge one. I mean, the other two are limited ones. So you have the textual corpus, then Mahabharata is an important text in that, and the Gita is actually a summary of the second layer meaning of the Mahabharata. And that's one way of looking at Mahabharata. And the second way that I mentioned in the beginning is that it is a central text of the Vedanta Darshanas, and that's the second source of legitimacy for the Gita. Then there are last two. The third is the nature of conversation, and the fourth is the content of conversation. And those two give us two different approaches to look at the Gita. So what I mean by nature of conversation. This is again another framework that the epistemic texts talk about. How do you identify a source as legitimate? Or how do you identify a statement as legitimate? So let me give, for example, a very mundane example. Let's say I don't know Japanese and somebody's speaking Japanese. I want to know the meaning of, or let's say I know a couple of words there and I don't know a third word. And I want to know the meaning of that third word. So I have multiple ways of trying to address this problem. One way would be I'll just go to an expert and ask him or her, what's the meaning of this word? I mean, I know that you're a scholar in Japanese. I mean, not even a scholar, your mother tongue is Japanese, and you converse in Japanese, and I believe you should be knowing this. And there's no reason for me to believe that you're probably, you may misinterpret or deceive me. I mean, there's no reason for me to assume any of that. So by default, I assume that you're an expert to be knowing this. And I know that you're reliable, and I'll just come to you and ask for a solution. That's what is generally understood by apti. That's the second term that I have used here. Apti is I know that you're reliable, you're an expert in this, and I have come here with no bad intentions, just to understand this. So therefore, there is no meaning for you to mislead me, which we do see in some of the textual discussions. And there is in this context, I'm probably not going to misuse your information, steal it, whatever. And the context is suitable for me to learn. So if all of these are satisfied, then I can just take the words on their face value and be happy with it and find that, well, this is a legitimate understanding of this word. The second way would be, well, I don't know whether that guy is really an expert. Or even if I know, I want to support that with a second layer of evidence. And then I may ask that guy, or I may myself go and find out, well, is there a dictionary? If there is a meaning that this word can be mapped with. So I will go and check some citations, some texts, and go to real scholars. I mean, this guy may not be a real scholar. So that's the second way of trying to understand the legitimacy of the meaning for a specific word. And then there can be a third way, which is I don't go to expert, neither would I go to text, because I can, in principle, ask a question on the legitimacy of the text. I mean, why should I believe that dictionary? Or why should I believe even that scholar? I mean, this is still, there is some amount of suspicion possible. So I'll go to the tools that I own, and that's the logic. And in that logic, possibly what I may do is, okay, here is word A and word B and word C. What are the possible meanings of this word in a given context? So okay, these are the A, B, C, D values that are possible, and I'll try to replace, substitute with multiple possibilities, and I find that one specific meaning is actually making most sense, and therefore, logically, this should be the meaning of this word. Or I'll try to establish that with an etymology of Japanese word roots, so this should be the meaning of this word. That's the third way, and that's the way a pure logician, somebody who may not be comfortable with texts or may not be comfortable in believing what this guy is saying, can go to. So these darshana texts largely fall in that third frame. For example, why should I believe in Krishna's words? I mean, what is evidence? And how do I construct evidence? Pratyaksha, Anumana, or Agama, why should I believe in any of these? Is it that the ontology actually defines epistemology, or epistemology defines ontology? Sorry if these are a little jargonous terms, but I guess the message is clear. Why should I accept in supernatural element, any supernatural element? Or how do I evaluate competing theories? And these are real logical domain questions. And this is the third way of trying to evaluate a theory. That's the scope of Darshana literature. So now, if we come back to Gita and apply this frame, it possibly is in the second layer. That's second in this slide, but is probably the first one. That's the apti. Because if you look at the way in which Arjuna positions himself with Krishna, and this is what is the nature of that conversation that I was talking about. Krishna is seen by Arjuna as a friend, philosopher, and guide. I mean, he's not doubting his expertise, his reliability. And therefore, there is an amount of apti that's already there. So he respects his words, and therefore, actually is not asking any evidential questions. He doesn't ask, why do you say so? Why do I need to believe what you're saying? What's the evidence for any of the theories that you're telling me? So he's believing in and is trying to make sense of of the teachings of Krishna. In fact, the first two quotations that I have given is just to make that point much more clear, that he surrenders to him saying, Krishna, I am your Shishya. Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam. I have surrendered to you. I have told you my problems and I don't know a solution. You give me a solution. I'm not questioning your expertise. I'm not questioning your reliability, but please give me a solution. And then he also says, when he tries to make it a little more academic in the second chapter, wherein says both karma and yoga are important, buddhi is much more important, but you should still be doing yoga and should still continue doing the yuddha. That's the swadharma. It's a little complicated in the second chapter. And therefore, at the beginning of the third chapter, Arjuna says, Krishna, I believe in you. Please tell me one specific answer. Tad ekam vada nishchitya yena shreyo aham apnuyam. With what will I get shreyas, the real benefit? One clear message, please provide me with that. I'm not in a position to evaluate evidence, or I'm not actually doubting you. So please give me that specific, clear answer. So that's the nature of this conversation. And therefore, for anybody interested in Gita, with the mindset of Arjuna, finds this interesting, because the kinds of questions that Arjuna is asking are the questions that we face in day-to-day life, conflicts and concerns, contradictions. So he is asking those questions. He's not doubting Krishna's ability, and is not even worried about whether I should be believing in what's the source, etc. So his questions are within the system. By within the system, I mean he's not going to the extent of questioning why shouldn't a Nastika school, which doesn't believe in soul or Brahman, should be accepted. Why can't that be accepted? I mean, that's not how Arjuna is framing the question. Arjuna is in fact framing it in the exact opposite. He's saying in the first chapter that Krishna, you see, if I lose the battle, or in any case, many people are going to die, and that's going to create a lot of instability in the society, and therefore the family structures, the rituals get disturbed, and that is the Dharma Shastras talk about that as a sure way of reaching hell. He says narake niyatam vasaha. It will lead me to naraka, because people die and you completely destroy the whole system, and the whole dharma collapses. Even if we win, I mean, so many people are dying, so who will take care of the society at large? So he is not he is positioning it within the dharma system, within the astika system. So Krishna has no burden of trying to explain the presence of Brahman, the presence of soul, etc. But he just need to explain the relationship of these three. So therefore, this kind of questioning provides a third narrative to the Bhagavad Gita. And I've just listed a few questions to make that point, that the questions are not evidence-based, but the questions are mostly explanatory. This is not an exact translation, it's a transcreation. So he says, how do I identify a sthita prajna? Here he's not asking, well, how do you even know that there is a person called sthita prajna, and why should that be a higher order goal? So those are not the questions. He's asking, I accept that there are sthita prajnas, and I accept your instruction that I should also be like that. Tell me what are the qualities of that guy. So I'll try to imitate that kind of an individual. Then he says in the third chapter, why should I engage in this war if, as you say, intent is more important than content? I mean, if you're saying you should be behaving in this way with this idea of tyaga, of swadharma, then I mean, even if I'm doing some tapas in a forest, wouldn't that suffice? So he's asking for specific explanations and clarifications. And so I'll just read out a few more questions. Why does an individual indulge in a sinful activity even while wanting to avoid it? That's his question. He's not asking evidence for that. These are friend philosopher conversations. How do I understand your existence from time immemorial? Which of the two is more important, renunciation or detached attachment? That's how I've tried to translate the karma yoga. How do I control my wandering mind? You're saying that I should focus on this, but my mind wanders. So tell me some tools. How can I control that? So these are the kinds of questions. So this brings us to the conclusion of the third narrative. So Arjuna represents openness. He's not actually asking about evidence for this, but he's believing in Krishna, that I want to learn, I want to engage in a dialogue with you, not in a debate. And then interestingly, Krishna ends with a mix of both. I mean, this is at the very end of the 18th chapter. He says, I have told you all I need to. Now you evaluate on your own and do what you like. And just a couple of verses later, he reiterates and says, forget everything, just believe in me and do what I say. So this is an interesting mix of Shraddha and Yukti. So because it's impossible to have an absolute neutrality in any engagement. So you need to start with some kind of Shraddha or Adara or Bhakti somewhere. At the same time, that should not lead you towards a blind belief or a superstition. Therefore, your own logical analysis evaluation is also important. So a mix of both is how Krishna ends it. So that's a third way of looking at the Bhagavad Gita. So I'll come to the last one. So should be able to finish in a couple of minutes. What's the content? This is about the conversation, nature of conversation. What's the actual content of Gita? And this you guys have already engaged in the last 9 sessions already. But I'm just trying to apply that framework that I presented at the beginning to know what's the actual content of the Gita. This is not rigid. I'm just trying to use this as an example. So what comes at the beginning? Krishna ridicules Arjuna's argument. I mean, he says, this just doesn't make sense. I mean, you're saying I can't be killing my own people. What's the point in having a kingdom, losing all my loved ones? I mean, those are ridiculous arguments. I mean, he doesn't even engage in that argument. And he says he wants to establish of permanence of soul and asserts the importance of Swadharma. That's what you see in the first 20-30 shlokas of the second chapter, when Krishna actually starts his narration. And at the end, as I said, evaluate these, do what you like, but at the same time, believe in me. And these are his specific instructions. What are the ideas that get repeated? So that's the other tool, the ideas of Swadharma, Bhakti, and Yoga. These are largely, you see these terms recurring multiple times. And this is actually, I think people use this for content analysis in media studies nowadays. To understand a presidential speech, look at each term, what has come X number of times, and the one that has been repeated multiple times should be one of the important key messages of that speech or text. So that's a similar way here. And then you have novelty. What's the one that strikes you in the whole episode of Gita is the Vishwarupa. That 11th chapter where Krishna is actually showing Arjuna his supremacy. At the same time, also showing that all these things, what you are doubtful about, are actually going to happen irrespective of what you decide, irrespective of how you try to look at this reality. So, nimitta matram bhava savya sachin is the verse there in the 11th chapter. So, this is all in my control, and I know that this is going to happen, and I'm telling you what you should be doing in this and how you have to relate to yourself, to me, and to Prakriti. So the Vishwarupa, the idea of Vishwarupa is the one that carries novelty. And the last two of that framework, what are the ideas that are mapped with benefits? The supremacy and absolute independence of Krishna. He makes that point at least a couple of times and maps that by saying, if you believe in this, you will actually be liberated. If you believe in this, all of your confusions will be clear. So there is a mapping to a specific benefit. And he says, breaking the bondage of the Prakriti is possible only with two ideas. One is be devoted to me and pursue your Swadharma. So if you follow these two ideas, you can be you can break this, the Prakriti's bondage. So that's how there is a mapping to a specific benefit. And there, what are the illustrations? I mean, you see in fourth chapter that he talks about, I actually told this to Surya, and then there is a tradition that has been lost, and I'm retelling the same ideas that were told earlier, and that's a story. Similarly, he mentioned specifically about King Janaka, saying, Janaka did similarly, and he attained moksha, and you should also be doing similarly. So, that's the illustrative part of content analysis too. And finally, what's the logic, inherent logic? I mean, he clearly says there is no alternative. Whether you do it or you don't, whatever you may decide, you will, for example, if you go away from this, you will actually be remembered as a guy who escaped from this war. And if you lose the battle or win the battle, it has no significance to history, but this is actually going to happen. And thirdly, the Prakriti will control you irrespective of your own wishes and ideas. So there is actually no alternative. And that's the logic that Krishna tries to provide multiple times. I mean, this is just an illustrative example that I was trying to provide as to how you can use the Mimamsa perspective to understand what's the message of Gita. So therefore, what's the primary purpose? And this was, I think, what Rahul also concluded very closely to this idea, that the whole message of Gita is how do you establish an optimal relationship between these three? That's the soul, the Prakriti, and Krishna. And he rejects the extremes, denying the presence or relationship between any of these three, by which I mean there is only Prakriti and therefore I'm completely embedded in it and I forget the Brahman, or I'm fully with Brahman and I forget my Swadharma. That's what that's what Arjuna more or less was trying to hint at. So Krishna rejects all these extremes and says he is advocating for a detached attachment, wherein you're detaching from the fruits, that's the sannyasa or tyaga, but you're still attached because that's your Swadharma with Prakriti. So that's it's kind of a dotted line with Prakriti and a solid line with Krishna. So Krishna, so your bhakti and you're completely in sync with the Supreme Being. That's the bhakti. That's the primary anchor. But at the same time, you're not away from Prakriti or embedded in Prakriti. So you have both detachment and attachment in Prakriti, while an absolute bhakti towards Krishna. And that's, I would say, we can probably summarize as the essence of Gita. Okay, so I think I'm mostly done. So what we found from these four narratives is that one, with that textual corpus approach, you can see this Bhagavad Gita as a quick summary of the whole Vedic corpus. A second way of looking at it from the Darshana view is that it's a critical philosophical analysis possible in this text because multiple commentators have actually engaged with this. And the third is what Arjuna represents. That's an approach of trying to be curious about philosophical principles and is interested in a dialogue, trying to understand what he should be doing. So the fourth, which is the content, is actually talking about a fundamental principle for the fundamental life, I would argue, for the fundamental conflict of life. How do you engage in a problem where your own personality may sometimes be at conflict? So how do you resolve that problem? And what should be my relationship with my, any individual, any organization, any activity for that matter? So that's the fourth way of looking at Gita. And this is for those of you who may be interested in an academic idea, a couple of ideas that I just listed down, that we can actually develop this Manvadi framework that I talked about, of how each character is potentially mappable. I mean, each story can be mapped with these conversations within our mind. And also we can probably use the framework of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas that I think Rahul talked about in the previous session as a conflict resolution tool. We can assess and guide individuals based on what is the nature of that individual? Is it more sattvic, more rajasic, more tamasic? And how do you find a balance? How do you resolve conflicts because of those? I mean, you can identify those who are who want to be ambitious and still be grounded in and are unable to get a balance in their thinking, may probably have a conflict between sattva and rajas. So is it their lifestyle? Is it the kind of activities that they're engaging in? So you can actually possibly create, I mean, this is an interesting possibility. I'm just proposing that individuals and organizations can use this as a tool for conflict resolution. I mean, except for this, I think I haven't touched on any of the modern applications possible. I thought, let me end with that. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Sorry if it's a little long. I wanted to make it probably less than 40 minutes so that we can have a few more questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srinidhi. So we can now invite questions. If anybody has a question, please voice it out.
Great lecture, Dr. Srinidhi. Really, really interesting, an analysis on the Manvadi description that you'd had. So I have a question on that, and this is more about how do we, in the context of Gita, how do we know that these characteristics are on these people? Like you explained how Yudhishthira and Bhima are related. One is the incarnation of Dharma, one is the incarnation of Vayu and the interpretations. How about the rest of the four characters? You said Draupadi can be related to Vidya. So how do I, as a layman, because I'm not very well versed into this system, how do I know how to analyze the characters and interpret them in that light?
Yeah, I think, I mean, let me share that slide again. So, okay, so can you see this, or should I make it full screen? So Yudhishthira as Dharma and Bhimasena as representing 10 such qualities. So even the others have actually been mapped. I mean, this is one interpretation, as I said, is seen in Madhvacharya's works. So he's arguing that Arjuna, so character of Arjuna should be mapped with Shravana, Manana, and Dhyana. Nakula is with Sheela, that's the personal character or behavior. Sahadeva with obedience, and Draupadi with knowledge. And knowledge is different from jnana here. Knowledge as in a knowledge base. So let me give you one example of how you can probably relate this to the story in Mahabharata. So this well-known episode of trying to disrobe Draupadi. So how do you look at it in this frame? This is so you're trying to disrespect a knowledge form. You're trying to disrespect the vidya, the embodiment of knowledge, and what you end up in doing so. In fact, it is possible to actually represent the Duryodhana, Dushasana characters also. One is considered possibly arrogance. The other is ignorance. The third, moving beyond ignorance to actually wrong knowledge, that is mithya-jnana. So those mental faculties within us, that is ignorance, arrogance, and a delusion in some sense, are trying to disrespect true knowledge. And if you do that, you end up with what happened to Duryodhana and Dushasana. So that's one very simplistic way of trying to look at this frame. Similarly, I think we can. This is actually a research project, I should honestly confess. I mean, except for these little pointers here and there that are available in the text, I don't think people have actually done a rigorous analysis of the Mahabharata with this approach. So we have these mapping available. So we should probably try to engage more on different stories and see how these aspects can be represented there, and what's the kind of conflict that they're trying to resolve, and who wins at the end. And if X wins, what does it mean? And therefore, what's the message for our own mental well-being? Beyond that, I think it is an unexplored area.
It's a great interpretation of this one incident, because before today's discussion, it was always seen in a light of, Draupadi is a lady who is in the middle of a political situation, being harmed, and sometimes being a female. I always took it in a very, very, negative aspect in Mahabharata. One thing that I could not ever find an explanation for why Draupadi was subjected to this kind of treatment. And there were people like Bhishma Pitama, etc., who are watching and not doing anything. But when you put it this way, it's a different light altogether. It probably was necessary to have this incident and, convey this message. So thank you. Thank you for this explanation.
So any more questions?
Do we have some text where we can read this in detail? Because right now, as I said, for me it's a layman interpretation of Gita and Bhagavatam. If we understand these contexts, probably it's easier to understand what is actually being tried to communicate.
There is one, I can actually share that. I think it was a series of lectures by professor at Bhandarkar Oriental Institute, who actually was the chief editor of the Mahabharat critical edition in the early 1900s. So there is a set of lectures available. I'll actually share that link in the group. He provides these three frames. I mean, he is trying to provide that more or less independently, and in his final, I think, last page, he makes this point that this is not a novel interpretation that I am giving, but is actually given by Madhvacharya in the 12th century. But there isn't much available except for the point made that this interpretation is possible and a mapping has been provided. But going beyond that, he does a little more of that. In this, I think it's Professor Subhyankar. I'll share that. But we really don't have much written in English to understand this. I think that's a project that some of us really need to take up. So.
Thank you. I'll wait for the link then.
Sure.
Okay, I have a technical question, and this is more for benefit of everybody. So when we say Mahabharata and we say it's written in Sanskrit, or it's in Sanskrit, what does it mean? Is it like all those shlokas, that 100,000 shlokas that are there? When we say it's written in Sanskrit, is it in Devanagari? Where is it? What form it is? Because I know you've done a great work on that. So maybe you could briefly touch upon what it means when people say that it's in Sanskrit. Is it what script is it? What language is used? Was the language spoken at that time Sanskrit, or Sanskrit is more like a language of elites? It's not the common man's language even in that time. So maybe a little bit of that.
Sure. So I mean, one important distinction that we really need to make is between language and script, especially when it comes to Sanskrit. We currently really don't have anything that can be called a Sanskrit script. And there is no evidence to my knowledge that there was any that can be seen as Sanskrit script. So script is only how you write it, whereas the language is the grammar and the vocabulary of that presentation. So we have Kannada, Hindi, English, all these as languages. And I mean, for example, this shlokas that I was writing here in the presentation were actually written in English script, right? But these are Sanskrit shlokas, and that's what I mean by Sanskrit in Mahabharata. So the shlokas are languages in Sanskrit, but the script may vary, and the script varies from the people who are writing it meaning copying it, because this is a very old text, and this is what we typically see in manuscriptology. We didn't. The only way in which you could get the text to the next generation is by literally copying it by hand, and that copying and the script that you choose to copy would be the one that you are more comfortable with. So I may be comfortable in writing in Kannada, so I can write this same verse using Kannada script. Angani Vedaha can be written in Kannada. It can be written in English, it can be written in Devanagari, it can be written in any script. So what we see now with respect to Mahabharata is that it's available now in more or less all scripts in the subcontinent, whereas it's the same verse, it is the same the articulation and the same text, the same pronunciation, but written in different scripts. And those scripts have more or less no bearing on that language, because you have the Varnamala, the alphabets largely match across the Indian scripts. They don't match with the European scripts, and that's why you find these diacritical marks. If you need to write Angani, you put a dot over N to suggest that it is a pronunciation of N, not N. And if you put a dot below N, it's a pronunciation of N, not N. So it's basically, maybe you have 26 letters here and you have 50 letters there. So you need to map with some mechanism. Whereas most of the or Indian scripts, they largely map with these. So therefore, you have different scripts. All of these can have the Mahabharata shlokas, but the Mahabharata original shlokas are in Sanskrit, and those are in any script. And there are people have written different translations, and those translations are obviously, when you translate, especially, I hope I did make that point clearly, because of the crispness and the multi-layered value that Sanskrit brings in. Even if you translate it verbatim, you lose a few layers in that translation. Let me give you a very simple example. Pankaja is a very popular term. Pankaj is also a popular noun in the subcontinent. The actual meaning of the word Pankaja, it has two meanings, two ways of getting at the meaning. One is based on the common parlance, and in common parlance, it refers to a lotus flower. And if you go to the etymological root, it refers to Panka is actually muddy water. Ja is something that is born out of it. So Pankaja etymologically refer to something that's born in a mix of water and mud. So because lotus actually has its origins in that situation, it actually carries that etymological sense also. Now, if you translate that word Pankaja into English, for example, and say lotus, you lose that etymological sense embedded within the word. So that's so that's what we mean by the language may be in multiple scripts, but the language has to be preserved in that original language to carry all of its meaning. So the Manvadi, Uparicharadi, especially the Uparicharadi meaning is possible only if you have Sanskrit in its origin, in its original, and not in a translated sense, because the words in Sanskrit can be interpreted to mean the properties of Lord, while actually talking about a specific storyline at a second layer. So, but when you translate it, you may be able to translate the story, but because the words have changed, they lose their etymological inherent ability, and therefore you lose that another layer of interpretation possible. And that's the difference between language, script, and translation.
I think that's a very good point, and that's exactly why I do that session on God, because in English, by and large, we translate it as God, Lord, and so on, and then how do I then explain somebody that, okay, when we talk about Paramatma or Brahman or all these, if I translate these as God, which is not wrong, then you lose that second layer meaning that you're saying. That is like,
Exactly. That's actually a very good example to illustrate this point. I mean, Brahman refers to something that is filled everything, filled everywhere. I mean, Brihati, or that which has grown to its maximum. So that's the literal etymological meaning of the word. Ishvara refers to one who is supreme to those who are themselves at a much higher pedestal. So Isha and then Vara is Ishvara. Vara is above, and Isha themselves are actually above others. So it's like God of gods, I mean, in some sense. So that's that. Therefore, Ishvara refers to supreme Lord. Similarly, Paramatma, Atma refers to souls, and Paramatma refers to supreme soul. So those are subtly different aspects or approaches of looking at God. But if you just translate it as God, which is not wrong, and you lose this interpretation possible. That's right.
So on that, what about the oldest manuscripts that you've come across? What script are they typically in? The oldest that we can ever find?
I mean, because my work was largely focused within the Dvaita Vedanta tradition, and the tradition itself being not more than 800 years old. A few that I have seen are about 500 to 600 year old scripts, but they are texts written about 8 centuries ago. That's about 800 years ago, but they were copied a couple of centuries later in another palm leaf, because I mean these, their shelf life and the wear and tear is quite high. I mean, you probably cannot preserve them beyond about 3 to 4 centuries maximum, and that's I'm surprised by some of the arguments that we see in the archaeology discussions nowadays as to, well, we can't, how do you say that Mahabharata is 3,000 year old? Can you show me a manuscript that's 3,000 year old or 5,000 year old? Can you show? I mean, these shelf lives, or the possibility of actually preserving them, is only for about 3 to 4 centuries. But with a very focused, and sometimes with some preservatives, you may preserve for up to about 7 to 8 centuries. Exceptionally, you have up to 2,000 year old manuscripts. I haven't seen them, but I've heard of these in some of the Nepali libraries. What I have seen personally is, I think, about 11th century one in the Pune Bhandarkar Institute, but that's kept mostly as a specimen for a museum. But the ones that I have used personally for deciphering, copying, and reading and editing are about 500 to 600 year old ones, and those are written. So I have seen in 2 scripts. One is Tulu, closer to Malayalam, in the coastal belt of Karnataka and Kerala. In the Deccan Plateau, we see what's called the Nandinagari script. It's actually it's prior to the Devanagari script, and the Devanagari is not more than 400 to 500 year old. So all those that were about in the 14th, 15th century, even up to 17th, 18th century, we see, because this is a gradual transition. Those who are comfortable with the earlier script, they continued in that writing. So we do find Nandinagari scripts. In fact, let me try, if I have one here, I can actually post that later. There is a Nandinagari script manuscript. No, I think I may have to search for that. I'll post that if possible. Sure.
Thank you. Do people have other questions? I think we have been very fortunate to have somebody like Dr. Srinidhi, and I say that because oftentimes what happens is that people who are well versed in Sanskrit may not be so well versed in Indo-European languages, particularly in English, and those who are well versed in English largely within the Indian subcontinent do not study Sanskrit. Definitely not at the depth and at the level at which Dr. Srinidhi has done. So very, very rare to get people like this. And so this is the opportunity. If you have any of those burning
Rahul, I think there's a question in chat.
yeah, I know. That's a bit of a personal question, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'll leave that to the end. But before that, is there any technical question, any questions on the message of Gita, or any questions even otherwise? Do that, and yeah, I'm aware of the question that is in the chat. I'll pick that up in the very last.
Rahul, this is Naveen. So Dr. Srinidhi, really good session. I have a question. You mentioned that we have interpretation for Astikadi and Manavadi. For Upracharadi, is there any translation which can be referred to? Or is it again, it goes back again to Gita?
No, Uparicharadi, as I mentioned, can possibly be mapped with the Vishnu Sahasranam. Because Uparicharadi is basically trying to say that everything that's being told in the Mahabharata is actually in praise of Lord. It's not a story, it's not even at a psychological plane, it's at a spiritual plane. And to get that, this etymological technicality is necessary. So these words are trying to going to their roots and see what kind of aspect of Lord is being talked about in that word. Is the meaning of Uparichara. And Vishnu Sahasranam is you have 1,000 names of Lord, and those are wherein you don't have these multiple interpretations required, but that is a explicit reference to Vishnu's names, and therefore there you have forced to make a meaning that matches with the property or a characteristic of Lord. And the idea there is use that as a template and see if you can extrapolate the whole of Mahabharata and the whole of different verses, different stories actually being in praise of the Lord. That's the third Uparicharadi. But beyond that, we don't see much written there. But I have seen, for example, these are largely academic intellectual exercises. I know the word Rama, the word Krishna have been interpreted in more than 100 ways to derive different meanings. And using classical Sanskrit grammar, you're not force-fitting, but it needs a huge amount of labor in knowing what are the kinds of roots that are possible, and by putting what suffix you get what meaning, and at the end of it you should still end up in a word that is exactly matching with Rama. You can't be force-fitting. So with all of that, people have tried a little, but not in the context of Mahabharata per se, but a few words here and there. Vishnu Sahasranama is a good starting point for that, how each word can actually refer to different aspects of the Lord.
So literally, if I were to translate Vishnu Sahasranam, it actually means the 1,000 names of Vishnu. So
right.
That's what it is trying to.
Right. And the important point there is the Vishnu Sahasranam starts with a clarification saying Yani Namani Gaunani Vishnu. This is actually a conversation between Bhishma and Yudhishthira. Bhishma is actually narrating after the war. Bhishma is narrating many stories, many things in the Shanti Parva and Anushasan Parva. And this Vishnu Sahasranam comes as a part of that. And there, Bhishma says that I'll be telling you 1,000 names of Lord. And these are Gauna Namas. These are Namas, these are names. And these are Gauna. Gauna refers to Guna. So each name should be interpreted for a specific guna, for a specific property, for a specific characteristic of the Lord. So it is talking about multiple ways in which Lord interacts or functions, etc. So those names are not sanketik. These are not symbolic names. So you can call anybody with any name, but that's not what it is. This actually has a meaning. That's the idea there.
Right. Any other questions?
Okay, so okay, Gaurav has this. So, well, I think.
So I'll just read out the question. The question over there says, what got you interested in Hindu mythology, and where do you see it see it most impact you today in your professional work? I think the question is coming because, as I mentioned, Dr. Srinidhi is a medical doctor. Besides that, he also has a PhD in public policy. He is a professor, he teaches. And the question is that with all that, how does this Hindu mythology fit in, and where did you get interest in that?
Sure, sure. Thanks. I mean, I don't think I'll be able to pinpoint a specific point from where it started. There is a, I belong to a family that follows Madhva tradition, and but I really didn't have an exposure in my early days to the philosophical technicalities. I started, and I really didn't have exposure to Sanskrit in its nitty-gritty details, because I was studying in rural Kannada medium schools in northern Karnataka, and we didn't have Sanskrit as a language. So it started only when I moved to Bangalore for class 11. But the college Sanskrit is really poor. These are just, in fact, people used to think that this is just a scoring subject. You can score well, and you don't need to, you can write in Kannada, you can write in English, and still get more or less 100 or 100 in Sanskrit. So, but that didn't help much. So I actually started rigorous studies during my medical school times. It just happened. But I think the real benefit that I have seen is largely in the way we could possibly look at some of these texts with a modern lens for a modern application. For example, in my PhD, I was looking at Ayurveda and biomedicine. So without getting into the technicalities, I should say that, because I was coming from the biomedicine training, it was much easier for me to actually engage in a philosophical and an Ayurveda exploration, compared to what I may have to do if I had come from Sanskrit and Ayurveda tradition. Because the political power and the hegemony that you bring in because of the modern education is significantly higher. I wouldn't have been happy to have a pure Ayurveda related research, though post facto, I think that could have given much more in terms of getting into the details of Ayurveda. So this integration of modern and traditional views helps to negotiate the political powers of today, wherein the hegemony lies largely with modern knowledge systems. But the beauty of trying to be exposed and immersed in the Indian knowledge systems in an emic perspective is, for example, when I was trying to look at Ayurveda, one of the most common theme that I was seeing in the in research literature is, how do you find an active ingredient for a drug from some herbal medicine? So you have some herbal medicines for therapeutic value reported in Ayurveda, and then you use completely modern approach of trying to see, okay, these guys are treating this for, say, malaria, and we know the etiology and the mechanism of how malaria affects in the modern scheme, and then use this drug, try to identify a chemical there which may be affecting the progression of malaria, and then you market that as a chemical. And I wasn't happy with this methodological confusion, and I think the greatest benefit that I could gather from the immersion in Indian knowledge systems is when I saw that they have a rigorous methodology and an epistemology inbuilt to that system. Then you can argue with these guys to say that, well, you may actually end up finding a drug for malaria from an Ayurvedic source, but in that process, you're actually missing the fundamental nature of how these guys identified this. And if you don't preserve this methodology, then for a later date, if there is another idea of, they were actually probably not even treating for malaria, they were treating for some other disease which mapped to their own ontology. So you have to look at the ontology, epistemology, and methodology within those systems, and then you can have conversations, you can have dialogue, but completely allopathizing or modernizing a system is actually similar to killing it with love. I mean, you may be saying that, well, I'm using Ayurveda and mainstreaming it, but in the process, if you strip it off its fundamental ontoepistemic systems, then the possibility of trying to see how these guys develop this and what are their assumptions about human body and how are these drugs working even in the absence of our understanding of modern systems. So if we lose those frames, then that's going to be a big loss. So I think for me, the greatest benefit has been to argue for what we have been calling the Parampara Bij Raksha. So you preserve these seeds at their in their traditional understanding, and use it for modern applications in n number of ways, but don't don't strip them of their own philosophical frame, so that you can apply those philosophical frames later when there is a need. So that, I think, has been the greatest impact that it has made on me.
Yeah, and if I were to summarize that, what essentially you said is that the modern, so you use the word allopathizing the Ayurveda. Yeah. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take out fish from Ayurveda without understanding the fishing methodology that was used at that time. So that I think is critical, because you are paying so much attention on the fish, which is actually the labor of that fishing, and totally ignoring the process through which the fish was being caught, whether it was a net or it was a rod or whatever other methods they were using. So that, I think, is a great point you made there.
I think there is one more point. I mean, that has helped me a lot. I mean, with the label of Indian knowledge, traditional knowledge, Sanskrit, Ayurveda. I mean, it's too harsh to say that, but I think more than 90 to 95% of that, of what we see in mainstream media or even half-baked research doesn't really have any basis within the system, or is not a rigorously understood application. So it actually, a real immersion has helped me for both things. One is to separate out where actually is the good rigorous understanding and knowledge that lies in these knowledge systems. And that's possible only when you go to the source. And these translations or the noise that we see around in terms of the greatness and everything. I mean, we have everything and everything is written there. I mean, that's largely not the real picture. So going into the origins or the actual studies help in both identifying how we can use it without stripping them of their philosophical traditions. At the same time, trying to be critically clear about where noise is and what can be usefully extracted.
Sure. Any other questions that anybody has? Okay, so if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Srinidhi. It has been absolutely a great session. Quite a few things I learned from it, and I'm sure everybody else also enjoyed the session. And with that also, we are concluding this 10 sessions journey that we had together. Started as my house was being renovated, so I had to temporarily move to another building. And in that building, there were quite a few people who were interested in, we had a casual discussion one day, and then I proposed, yeah, I can teach this if people are interested. And that building had disproportionate number of Indians as compared to where I live now. So I did 2 sessions, which was largely in the house I was living. And then government put a restriction that you cannot have gatherings. But people were still interested in continuing that. So I decided, okay, why not do this online, because we can't meet physically. And with that, I redid those 2 sessions that I'd already taught in a physical form. And then we completed these 10 sessions. And now it's so lovely that now that today is our 10th session. And only yesterday it was that government has opened up, like now people can go to each other's house and meet. So the timing was impeccable. Like it started and it ended at the right time. So I personally enjoyed this journey, and thank you so much, everybody, for quite a lot of things I had to revise, I had to rebuild, to spin in a different format than I had done before. So it was a very interesting journey for me, and thank you so much for that association, which allowed me uh, to explain the concept that I learned from somebody, and not just that, and also to in that process. Because I had to dig deeper, I had to meet people like Dr. Srinidhi. So for me, it has been a really beautiful journey, and thank you so much, everybody, for this.
Rahul, will there be another batch you will be doing or any follow-up sessions on this?
Well, I don't know at this point in time. To be honest, quite a few of you have suggested me to put this course as a book. So I never gave it a this thought before, but now I'm thinking that why not? Because people normally, as even Dr. Shindi was saying, people normally would take Gita and explain it chapter by chapter, shloka by shloka, which is fine, which is the bona fide way of doing it. But from a modern application perspective, what is really important is to make this wisdom available to people like you and I, who go to a very elite school in India, then go on to having education in the modern system, going to IITs and IIMs, and totally stripped of their roots, totally not aware of the inherent wisdom that is there in our own system. So I think next, what I would be doing is this time that I was spending with you over Saturdays, morning of Saturdays, I would probably be utilizing that to textualize whatever I have spoken in the last 10 sessions. And once that project is complete, then maybe I will revisit and probably I'll then do these sessions again. Having said that, I have proposed to few IIMs that I want to do these sessions. Now, depending on which IIM accepts that proposal. Now, again, that is something which I find very ironic, because most of the IIMs that I propose this to, they say, yeah, but our students are mostly interested in valuation of CDS or doing some financial modeling. Can you teach that? And I'm like, yeah, of course I can teach that. But then what is the delta that I bring? Because there is so much talent which is available to teach how you come to interest rate derivatives. But there are very few people such as Dr. Srinidhi who can marry that traditional knowledge with the expertise of modern wisdom or modern knowledge system that he has gone to. And unfortunately, what I feel is that in our Indian context, very ironically, it's only when the West adapts all this that we learn this back. Same with yoga, same with a lot of other things that we have given to the West. Only then we take it back rather than building it bottom up. So only now that Harvard has courses such as this Gita, or such as learning from Hindu scriptures, we may still be very reluctantly trying to do this. So I'm very perplexed that we do not give so much importance to our own indigenous knowledge system that we have. So at least at my level, I'm trying to push that. I'm trying to push that in the IIMs that I have a relationship with, to bring this course to a large number of people in elite academic institution. And the idea there is that once the IIMs and IITs of India accept this, it will trickle down to tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 colleges as well. So that's what it is largely, Neha. But is there anything specific that you had in mind when you asked that question or when you proposed that?
Not specific, but it will be good to keep the engagement going. These the kind of topics are very easy to lose out when we don't have an active engagement going on with our lives, with everything opening up, re-engagement with office and all. So it would have been a good if we could have continued in some format, maybe a different thing, just to keep the engagement going and keeping everyone interested in the topic. Just
Sure. So let me think about it. Let me think about if I can bring in a team of like-minded people, bring in a team of experts who can, like Dr. Srinidhi, where we could do some kind of follow-up lectures on from various experts on various aspects. So let me give it a thought. I will try my level best to make sure that this journey that we have started continues.
thank you.
Anybody else has any words to add? Any realizations? Anything that you say? before I close the session?
Rahul, Naveen, I think the session you, Galina, and also Dr. Srinidhi, which they did was really good. And it's quite inspiring, at least to go in that direction and start working out on our end, like what are the directions and how do we benefit from that day-to-day life. So I think it was great. And like Neha mentioned, that it would be great to keep the engagement going in some or the other form. So yeah, I'm looking forward to a similar session moving forward. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you, Galina, and to Dr. Srinidhi.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you, Naveen. If there is anybody else who would like to voice out, this is an opportunity.
It's a great session, Rahul. Thanks for arranging it. I would like to continue this going forward, engage with this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, Rahul. I think thanks a lot for taking this initiative, putting this together. I know a lot of research goes into this. So I wanted to really thank you and Galina. It was very good use of the time during this circuit breaker, right? Very productive. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev.
Yeah, I wanted to express my gratitude to all you guys as well. It's a lot of hard work, and then Rahul, you have effectively very well capitalized on your network to bring Dr. Srinidhi in today, and for an amazing conclusion. It's a great wrap up. It leaves us thinking, that hey, what are the different planes in which we could be evaluating anything in life, any text or anything that we come across. So you have left us on a cliffhanger, and it's very interesting one, because now there's onus on us to do our own bit of intuitive thinking as well. But yes, like what others mentioned, Neha, I had a good idea that some form of engagement would be interesting, but I know you're quite tied up too. So let's see how it goes. But really, thank you all you guys. It has been great.
I would just add that Rahul, you summarized it very well. The thought that Rahul has left us at a cliffhanger, very well summarized.
I'm glad.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think we will conclude the session now. Thank you so much for this wonderful journey that we have had together. I will give some serious thought as to how we can continue this, and we can make the best of whatever resources I have. If you know people that that could be approached, please suggest so. Let's keep the group active now that it's not the time to leave the group. I would strongly urge you not to leave the group, even though we have formally completed the session. Now is the real. Actually, now is when the journey starts. Actually, in some sense. So keep sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, Rahul, sorry, I woke up, to just add that, the group is active, and please, if you have like any burning issues or non-burning, something you would like to discuss or anything, please just shoot it on a group, and then let's just keep on going with that. And I guess the main thing with this kind of engagement with the scriptures or whatever other knowledge is not just, listen to it and then forget about it. I guess that hopefully that, because like from my own experience, when I got to know about it, it never left my life the way it was before. So you look at the things in a different way. So I just sharing, if we keep it close to our heart and our mind, and like see it in different life situations, and if it helps us to come out of some of the conflicts or tensions or difficulties by looking, by using what we have learned from it, that will already be a very good thing. And yes, please, like if there are any interesting things to discuss, please just shoot them on the group. It will be good way of engaging with the knowledge.
Yep. Thank you so much, Karina, for that addition. And thank you, everybody, once again for this wonderful journey we have had together. And please stay active on the group. Please share whatever life realizations, whatever else you want to share on the group. And with that, I would say the journey has just begun. And unfortunately, I'll have to conclude the session, but the journey has just begun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll wait for season 2.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.